What's happening, guys, and welcome back. My name is Craig Rayner, and today is another tutorial on camera basics. Just like my cup of coffee, there is three main ingredients with the exposure of our photographs. So let's get into the intro and let's start. Photography has three main ingredients to the exposure, and it's called the triangle of exposure. So an equilateral triangle with ISO, aperture and shutter speed. And now each one of these will complement one another, and without one the other two won't work. Now every time we move one, the other ones will have to be adjusted in order to get a better exposure, because obviously when we move one it will either get brighter or darker. So take shutter speed. Now shutter speed is there to capture or add movement into our images. So if we're trying to capture something really fast, we're going to take that photograph and have a really high shutter speed to capture that movement exactly how we want. So if we've got our dog outside running around, or our kids up and down the field, or swimming or running and riding their bike, or even if we're doing sports photography, you want to capture that action right there and then, and you want to get a really fast shutter speed, and it will freeze that motion in time. So take a look at this image here. This one here is taken at 1/2000 of a second, and it's showing you how the waves look and what they were looking like on that day and how rough they were. We can see the severeness of the waves and how powerful they are. But take a look at this one. Now if we slow that shutter speed right down to 3.2 seconds, you can see that having a slower speed is added a very milky, smoky effect onto our sea scene. So it's giving you a completely different story. You can see a very violent, severe scene of how the waves are crashing against the side, or you can see a very calming effect to our sea. Now once we've done that, we're going to look at aperture. Take a look at this self-portrait. Now at f1.8 you can see it's giving us a very shallow depth of field. So f1.8 means that we've got a bigger opening on our lens, so it's letting more light into it, which means that we've got to have a faster shutter speed in order to complement our aperture. By having a faster shutter speed, it's not going to overexpose our image, because we want a shallow depth of field because of it being a portrait. When we say shallow depth of field, you can see the foreground and the background behind me. Now the blurred bit is what we call bokeh. And in all our portraits, it is a very beautiful thing to look at when you're taking photos. And you can see this on your new mobile phones. If you've got a new iPhone 10 or a 10s, you can certainly see that when you go onto portrait mode, which is added onto our phones, the background becomes blurred. It's giving us a fake number in aperture at f1.2, f1.4. It's a digital blur. Now look at the second photo at f22. We want to see the whole landscape and we want to keep it all sharp. We want to see the landscape we're at. So if we're doing normal generic landscapes, or we're looking at the self-portrait and we want to keep it and show where we are, we're going to crank that aperture up into f8, f11, f22 in order to make sure that image is sharp. So when we talk about ISO, it's dependent on whether we're indoors or outdoors. Essentially, ISO is fake light. It's the sensitivity of our sensor in our camera. And for those who remember the film days, it's the ASA, what was called ASA film. ASA 100, 200 or 400. And obviously the bigger the number, the more sensitive our sensor is. Now the new cameras like the Canon EOS R5 can go up to 51,200, which is incredibly sensitive. Now the danger with that is the higher the number, the more grain, or what's called noise, is added to your camera. So have a look at this. You can see the higher it goes, the grainier the image goes. But it is allowing us to add fake light. So if we're indoors, we can go and take photos at ISO 3200 and still keep little grain onto our image, but it allows us to complement it with our aperture or shutter. So what I tend to do, guys, is I tend to start off by setting my aperture to start off with and then changing my shutter and ISO to then complement what I want to do. So if I'm taking photos indoors, I will set my aperture to start off with at f2.8 or f1.8, because that's what I want in order to capture the portrait, because I want to isolate them from the scene. I will then change my shutter speed to complement the aperture, so maybe 250th of a second, just because I want to make sure I capture it as still as possible without any camera shake or motion blur. Once I've done those two, I will then increase my ISO in order to make sure our equilateral triangle is back to its original form. So if I have to go up to 3200 in our ISO, that's what I will do, but I'll be very careful in not increasing it too much, because obviously the higher the number, the grainier the image we are going to get. So that's it guys for camera basics. Just remember that if you change one, you need to change the other ones in order to keep your triangle of exposure as equal as possible. So remember guys, just like Pirates of the Caribbean, these are more guidelines than rules. So they're there to be broken, they're there to have fun. So have some motion blur in it, crank up your ISO to add a bit of grain, to add a different dynamic to your image. But overall guys, what you need to do is have a play with them, but have fun with taking photos. And on that, I'll see you next time.